in just 17 focused minutes inside one of the most influential buildings in the U.S. One woman turned a personal attack into a timeless example of leadership. As hundreds of lawmakers looked on in stunned silence and cameras documented every moment, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett delivered a response so composed and powerfully calm that her critic was left without words. And the nation took notice. This is a story about what unfolds when preparation meets provocation, when dignity answers hostility, and when a woman shaped by Texas courtrooms shows Washington what true influence looks like. It's more than just political theater, it's a story of resilience, strength, and the kind of courage that doesn't shout to be heard. What you're about to see isn't merely a moment in politics, it's a lesson in poise under pressure. It shows how calm conviction can disarm confrontation and inspire change. It's the kind of response that earns respect, even in the most challenging encounters. The United States Capitol stood tall beneath a soft afternoon light, its dome glowing with the golden hue of what was supposed to be a routine day. Inside the rotunda, anticipation quietly built as lawmakers arrived for what was intended to be a celebratory occasion. The signing of the Educational Opportunities and Excellence Act. The grand circular room echoed with low conversations. Senators straightened their jackets, representatives glanced at their phones, and aides moved efficiently through rows of carefully arranged chairs. There was a cordial, almost cheerful tone in the air. After months of debate, both parties had finally reached a consensus on education reform. But under the surface, something was off. Smiles seemed rehearsed. Conversations halted when certain people passed by. A subtle tension flickered in the air like the stillness before a storm. In the third row among the Democrats sat Jasmine Crockett, a Texas congresswoman known for her keen legal skills and unwavering composure. She wore a tailored navy suit that conveyed quiet authority. Her posture was upright yet at ease, and her expression calm and watchful. To casual observers, Jasmine looked like she was simply waiting for the event to begin. But those familiar with her courtroom past would have noticed the signals. Her briefcase was placed precisely beside her chair, its contents meticulously arranged. Color-coded folders, yellow, blue, red, green, peeked out from the opening. One, labeled Backup Evidence, would soon become key. On her lap rested a leather-bound notebook. A gold pen moved smoothly across the pages, not jotting down thoughts, but laying out a plan. Her handwriting was small, precise, deliberate. This was not the work of someone taking notes, it was the mark of someone preparing to lead with clarity. Every so often, she looked up, scanning the room. Her practiced eye took in every detail, posture, tone, glances exchanged. Years of questioning tough witnesses had taught her to see beyond words and read the intent behind them. And today she sensed something brewing. A house aide leaned over to whisper to a colleague, "Why does Representative Crockett look like she's prepping for a trial instead of a photo op?" The comment was more accurate than he knew. The night before, Jasmine had received a message, short but pointed. "Watch Melania tomorrow. She's planning something about Biden. It's meant to go viral." Many in her position might have dismissed it or handed it to security. But Jasmine Crockett was not like most. She had built her career in adversarial settings, where readiness was everything. So, instead of attending social events or fundraisers, she spent her evening at her desk, surrounded by legal texts and case files. She wasn't preparing to retaliate, she was preparing to clarify. Not to fight, but to tell the truth. Now, seated in the Capitol with 5 minutes until the ceremony began, she held something more effective than outrage or suspicion. She had preparation. She had knowledge. And she had the deep, quiet confidence that only comes from knowing the facts. As the first speaker walked up to the podium, the air seemed to cool. Jasmine checked the time, clicked her pen once, and calmly opened the folder labeled Grace under. History was about to be made, and she was ready. The change in the room's energy wasn't announced, it simply happened. Conversations faded, heads turned, and cameras instinctively adjusted their lenses. As Melania Trump stepped into the rotunda, she moved like someone born to command the spotlight. Wearing an ivory dress tailored so precisely it looked as if it had been painted onto Her. Each step was deliberate, every angle picture perfect. Her hair caught the light just right, her smile seemed designed for the camera, and her posture reflected years of living under public scrutiny. Her entourage followed with flawless coordination. Aides in matching navy suits surrounded her. One carried a sleek leather folder with gold initials. Another scanned the room with the sharp focus of a seasoned political strategist, familiar with every kind of audience. From her seat, Jasmine didn't turn to look. Years of courtroom work had taught her to observe without being noticed. Using her peripheral vision, she tracked Melania's movements, noted her timing, and mentally recorded every detail. She had already spent hours reviewing Melania's past speeches, studying her patterns, memorizing her go-to phrases and rhetorical techniques. The contrast between the two women was stark. Melania embodied poise and presentation shaped by stylists and media advisors. Jasmine was all substance and resolve shaped by legal battles and long nights in law libraries. Melania took her seat 2 rows ahead. She opened her leather folder with practiced ease. Jasmine caught a brief glimpse inside, not one but 2 versions of a speech. One was marked with highlights, the other filled with handwritten notes crammed into the margins. For a fleeting second, their eyes met across the chamber. No smiles, no nods, just silent calculation. 2 sharp minds sizing each other up, both knowing that before the hour ended, only one would shape the story that would leave this room. In the press section, murmurs began. "She's early. That's not like her. I heard she might go off script, try to create a viral moment." But anyone who thought Melania Trump was unprepared had misjudged her. This wasn't off the cuff. It was deliberate. She had come to this event with an agenda that extended far beyond honoring education reform. Then came the formalities. The Speaker of the House walked confidently to the podium, clearly a veteran of such ceremonies. His voice carried easily across the rotunda as he opened the event that would soon be remembered not for the legislation being signed, but for the verbal duel it would ignite. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues and honored guests," he began. "It is my pleasure to introduce a woman whose advocacy for children has earned national recognition, former First Lady Melania Trump." The applause that followed was respectful but clearly split. Republicans clapped warmly. Democrats offered courteous but measured recognition. It was the sound of a room trying to stay civil while bracing for the unexpected. As Melania rose and moved toward the podium, every camera locked onto her. She had always drawn attention, and today would be no exception. But this time, she wasn't. The only one who had come prepared, Melania Trump, approached the microphone with the assurance of someone who had addressed the world from this very place before. Her opening lines were smooth, praise for bipartisan collaboration, acknowledgement of education's value, and a nod to her Be Best initiative promoting children's welfare. For several minutes, everything unfolded as expected. The crowd settled into the usual rhythm of political ceremonies. Even Jasmine, despite all her careful planning, started to wonder whether the anonymous tip she had received had been incorrect. Then, Melania's tone began to change. It began subtly. A small shift in rhythm, a barely noticeable firmness edging into her tone. She glanced at her notes, and when she looked up again, there was something different in her expression, something sharper. "Of course," she began, pausing just long enough for the room to become attentive. "For education policies to be effective, they need clear implementation and strong leadership." She paused again, this time longer, a silence that made people unknowingly hold their breath. "Unfortunately," she continued, her voice still, gentle but now carrying a distinct sharpness, "what we've observed from the current administration seems to stem from—" She halted once more, a slight smile forming at the corners of her mouth. "Cognitive challenges that appear to be worsening over time." The words landed like a punch. The silence that followed wasn't respectful, it was stunned. The kind of quiet that happens when something shocking unfolds in plain sight. But Melania wasn't finished. "When the president forgets the names of his own cabinet," she said, sounding measured and intentional, "when he loses his way after speeches, unsure of where to go, when he has to be guided like a disoriented child." Her gaze swept the room, nearly meeting Jasmine's eyes. "How can we trust such leadership with our children's education?" The response was swift and intense. On the Republican side, subtle smirks appeared. Some lawmakers leaned back in their chairs with the air of spectators watching a decisive blow. One congressman even let out a faint chuckle. Democrats, on the other hand, stiffened immediately. Jaws clenched, arms crossed, brows furrowed in visible disbelief. Several glanced toward the speaker's podium, silently urging him to intervene. But he stayed still, expression neutral, even as his grip on the podium tightened. In the press gallery, fingers flew across keyboards and phones. This wasn't just a newsworthy moment, it was one that could shift careers and rewrite narratives. Cameras clicked rapidly, trying to capture every second of the unfolding scene. Amid it all, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands rested gently on her folder. Her breathing was deliberate. 4 counts in, a pause, 8 counts out. Her face was unreadable, but those familiar with her would have recognized the signs. This wasn't surprise or fear. It was focus. Melania kept going, blending her critique with commentary on declining test scores and weak leadership. Her delivery was polished, biting, and clearly prepared. She had taken what was meant to be a moment of bipartisan celebration and used it to launch a personal attack, but she had made a critical mistake. She believed her target would be caught off guard. She hadn't anticipated Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had built her reputation on being ready for exactly this kind of confrontation. Who knew that the most effective answer to calculated malice wasn't fury but truth, delivered with precise control. As Melania ended her remarks to scattered applause, tension rippled through the room. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something significant. What they didn't realize was that the real moment was still ahead, because now it was Jasmine's turn. The speaker returned to the podium, wearing the strained expression of someone trying to maintain decorum in a space that no longer felt stable. His voice carried the cautious tone of formality as he thanked Melania for her thought-provoking remarks, words that rang hollow. Then, with what could only be described as relief, he announced, "Next, we will hear from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas, who played a key role in shaping the equity provisions in this important legislation." The moment had arrived. Jasmine closed her notebook with a composed motion, not a slam, not an angry display, just a smooth press of her hand. She capped her pen with a quiet click and rose from her seat with the calm assurance of someone who had spent her life getting ready for this moment. Her presence commanded attention not through theatrics, but through quiet confidence. She rose to her full height, steady and unshaken. She began walking toward the podium with steady, deliberate steps. Every eye in the chamber followed her movement. The sound of her heels tapping against the marble floor created a calming rhythm, gradually easing the tension that Melania's earlier remarks had stirred. Each step was intentional, full of certainty and quiet assurance, the kind shown by someone who knew exactly what she came to do. She carried no stack of notes, no dramatic visuals, just her preparation and an unwavering belief in the power of truth delivered with dignity. When she reached the podium, she placed her hands gently on either side, aligning herself precisely with the microphone. Her shoulders were squared, her posture upright but relaxed. For a brief moment, she simply surveyed the room, not seeking approval or gauging political advantage, but quietly taking in the space and the silence. Then she spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker." Her voice was warm, steady, and carried a calm authority rooted not in volume but in conviction. With those few words, the atmosphere in the chamber had already started to shift. "I came here today to talk about education," she continued. "To talk about classrooms, opportunity, and what this legislation means for children in communities like the one where I was raised." She paused, letting the words settle, reminding everyone why they were truly there. But silence. She continued, "In the face of mockery is not an option." The room fell into complete stillness. This wasn't the kind of opening anyone had anticipated, but it was instantly clear that something important was about to unfold. "I've spent most of my career in courtrooms," Jasmine went on, her tone still conversational but gaining quiet strength. where decorum and decency are essential. She had learned, she said, that when someone crosses a line, the most respectful response is sometimes to simply hold up a mirror. With that, she reached up and slowly, purposefully removed her glasses. It was a small, almost personal gesture, but it echoed through the room like ripples on still water. Without the barrier of her lenses, her gaze became more open, more personal, more powerful. It felt as if she had stepped out from behind the armor public figures often wear, offering something honest and unguarded. "I'm not here to trade insults," she said gently, her voice firm. "And I'm certainly not here to defend a man who's more than capable of defending himself." She paused. "But I'm here to defend a principle and a line that was crossed today." Melania's expression remained composed, but the tension in her posture betrayed unease. This was not the emotional reaction she had likely expected. "There's a difference," Jasmine continued, "between disagreeing on policy and demeaning someone's humanity. That distinction matters." Her words landed not with noise, but with quiet weight. People weren't just hearing her, they were absorbing her message, being challenged and uplifted by it. "I've learned that when your position is solid, you don't need to shout. When your argument holds weight, there's no need for hostility. What you need," she paused, "is clarity." She looked briefly down at the podium, then raised her eyes again, meeting the room with a look that felt both inclusive and direct. "And so, let me be clear. What followed would be remembered long after the specifics of the education bill faded from memory." Jasmine's voice stayed calm as she launched into what would become one of the most precisely delivered rebuttals in recent political discourse. But it wasn't angry. It was deliberate, carefully crafted like a seasoned lawyer presenting evidence. "I've listened closely to the remarks we just heard," she began, her eyes not on Melania but directed above the room, lifting the tone rather than lowering it. "And I couldn't help but recall other words spoken by the same voice, but with a very different meaning." She opened a single folder that had been sitting on the podium, not with drama, but with the smooth efficiency of someone referring to well-prepared material. "May 7th, 2018, she read aloud. "At the launch of the Be Best initiative, Mrs. Trump stated, and I quote, 'We should strive to provide children with the tools they need to cultivate their social and emotional health and teach positive ways to communicate both online and in everyday interactions.'" The irony lingered in the air. Jasmine didn't need to highlight it, the contrast was unmistakable. Later that same year, she continued, in an interview with ABC News, she said, "We need to have more tolerance. For people with different beliefs and backgrounds, we need to be kinder to one another and respectful of our differences." The silence in the chamber deepened. This wasn't a rebuttal, it was reflection. Jasmine was holding up Melania's own words like a mirror, pointing out the contradiction without ever raising her voice. In April 2019, Jasmine continued, Mrs. Trump had tweeted, "I encourage everyone to be kind to each other and to show respect both in daily life and on social media." Jasmine gently placed the printed tweets back on the podium with the same precision with which she'd lifted them, lining them up carefully as if filing them into the public record. "I'm not bringing up these quotes to embarrass anyone," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I bring them up because I believe they mattered when they were first said. I believe they were sincere, or at least meant to be." She looked across the chamber, meeting the eyes of people on both sides of the aisle. But words, especially from public figures, don't stand alone. They're commitments, they set standards. And when we go against the very values we once spoke for, when we use age, health, or vulnerability to hurt others, we're not just being inconsistent. She paused, letting the gravity of her next words settle in. "We're teaching our children that empathy depends on the situation, that respect is just strategy, and that kindness is optional." A quiet murmur of agreement stirred in parts of the room. Even some Republicans shifted in their seats, glancing at their programs or down at the floor. "This education bill," Jasmine continued, "is supposed to focus on what we teach our children, the examples we set, and the future we're building. If we expect our kids to act with kindness, maturity, and emotional intelligence, those values have to start with us, here, now." She reached for her glasses and put them back on, not to shield herself, but to complete her point. She was composed, present, and clear. Because our children are watching, they're learning. And they deserve leaders who show them that strength and grace can live in the same person. That you can disagree without tearing each other apart. That real power isn't about putting others down, but about raising the level of the conversation. The chamber was completely still. Even the press gallery had paused. No typing, no photos, just listening. Listening to something that had been missing from political speech for a long time. Truth without anger, strength without hostility. Jasmine had done something rare. She had turned a personal insult into a chance to teach. She answered cruelty with dignity, and in doing so, showed everyone in the room, and soon the country, what leadership really looks like. But she wasn't done. After laying out the principle, she made it personal, something that would reach hearts across America. There's something most people in this room don't know about me, she began. Her tone changed, still strong, but more personal now. Before I ever ran for office, before I stood at any podium, I was just a daughter. The energy in the room shifted. This was no longer just politics. It was human. My father was a math professor, she said. A brilliant man who could solve complicated equations in his head faster than others could write them down. For most of my life, I thought there was no problem he couldn't solve. Her hands rested steadily on the podium. Her voice was clear, but for those watching closely, there was a softness in her eyes, someone recalling something dear. But as he got older, my father started to change. At first, it was small, forgetting names, losing his place in calculations he used to do with ease. Then it got worse. I watched the man who once taught calculus to thousands struggle to remember how to tie his shoes. The chamber was quiet in a different way now, not shocked, but reverent, understanding the weight of what was being shared. I saw people start talking around him, not to him. I saw judgment enter rooms before he did. And I saw people decide that because his mind was changing, everything he had done, his wisdom, his love, his contributions suddenly didn't matter anymore. Jasmine's voice didn't falter, but the emotion was evident. But here's what I learned, she said, her voice steadying and gaining strength. His value was never less because of his condition. His dignity wasn't lost because of his illness. His humanity wasn't reduced by the challenges he faced. She paused, letting the truth fill the room. The only thing that ever diminished him was the choice others made to mock him. The effect was immediate. A few people looked down. A Republican staffer who had smiled earlier now stared ahead, unreadable. In the press gallery, a seasoned reporter quietly wiped her eyes. And that, Jasmine said, is the line we're all responsible for protecting. Not just as elected officials or public servants, but as people. Not because it helps us politically, but because it's the right thing to do. Her voice deepened with resolve. I'm not standing here to win political points. I'm here because I've seen what happens when someone is reduced to an illness rather than remembered for their life. I've seen the quiet cruelty of mockery, dressed up in polite words. And I've seen the damage it causes not just to the person targeted, but to everyone who witnesses it, especially children. She leaned forward, not to press, but to leave one clear truth. Dignity, she said, isn't something we ask for. She paused. It's something we show. Her words hung in the air like a benediction. No one moved. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with Democrats, but it didn't stop there. It spread until even some Republicans joined in, not clapping for a party, but for a principle. By the time Jasmine stepped back from the podium, the applause had filled the rotunda. It wasn't just appreciation, it was recognition. They had just witnessed something rare in politics, real leadership. Live and unfiltered. The official ceremony continued. Papers still had to be signed, photos still needed to be taken, unity still had to be shown. But everyone in the room knew the real moment had already happened. As Jasmine returned to her seat, colleagues leaned in quietly. That was incredible. You struck the perfect tone. You've just changed the whole conversation. She received the praise with thanks, but didn't dwell on it. For her, this wasn't about creating a moment. It was about standing up for a principle. Melania remained in her seat. Posture still technically perfect, but noticeably more stiff. The poise she had shown earlier had been replaced by something harder to read. Her staff subtly shifted, placing themselves between her and approaching reporters. The stairway wasn't where the real story was unfolding. It was in the press gallery. Phones buzzed constantly with alerts. Reporters typed away urgently, the atmosphere buzzing with the electricity of breaking news. Within minutes, tweets started pouring in. Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in grace under pressure. This wasn't just politics, it was a moment of moral clarity. Crockett had taken a personal attack and turned it into a lesson in basic decency. Hashtags quickly followed. Hashtag dignity demonstrated, hashtag Crockett moment, hash leadership lessons. In newsrooms nationwide, editors scrambled to adjust. This wasn't just political drama, it was a story about humanity, leadership, and values that crossed party lines. Cable networks restructured their evening schedules. The education bill that was supposed to lead the headlines had been eclipsed by what commentators were already calling the dignity moment on MSNBC. One analyst remarked, "That was rhetorical jujitsu." Crockett used the momentum of the attack to show why it was wrong. She didn't just win, she raised the level of the entire discussion. Even conservative outlets acknowledged the moment. One right-leaning host said, "I don't agree with all of Representative Crockett's views, but that was a lesson in grace and strength." She didn't fall for the provocation, she changed the whole conversation. But perhaps the most surprising reactions came from unexpected corners. Republican staffers privately shared the clip as an example of how to handle pressure. "This is how it's done," a senior GOP aide reportedly told his team. "Not with anger, but with readiness and principle." Within hours, Crockett's response went beyond politics. It was being used in corporate training sessions as a case study in calm leadership. Teachers showed it in classrooms to illustrate dignity during conflict. At dinner tables, parents used it as a way to teach standing up for what's right. The contrast with Melania's insult was stark. While Melania aimed to belittle, Jasmine lifted the moment. Where Melania divided, Jasmine found unity at least. In the shared belief that dignity shouldn't be a casualty of politics. In the following days and weeks, something rare happened. Crockett's speech began showing up in places far from Capitol Hill. At a university in Pennsylvania, a communications professor revamped his curriculum. Rather than start his crisis communication course with traditional examples, he opened with Jasmine's remarks. "This," he told his class, referencing the moment she took off her glasses, "is what strategic authenticity looks like." She didn't raise her voice, she raised the bar. That's power through preparation, not performance. Corporate boardrooms embraced the video too. One Fortune 500 company created a full training session titled Leadership Through Dignity, Responding with Clarity. In Chicago, an HR director played the clip in a civility workshop. "This is how you respond when someone tries to undermine you," she explained. "Don't match their energy, rise above it." But it wasn't just institutions paying attention. Everyday people began sharing their own experiences inspired by Jasmine. A teacher from Ohio wrote, "In staff meetings, I've been humiliated in front of leadership. Jasmine reminded me staying quiet doesn't mean staying weak. It can mean staying strong." A young attorney tweeted, "Every woman in a male-dominated space needs to see this. She didn't get louder, she got clearer." That's how you respond, not react. A grandmother from Michigan posted, "I'm 68 and I've spent years being talked over or ignored." What Crockett did wasn't just political, it was personal. She stood up for all of us who've been told to just smile and stay silent. The phrase, "dignity isn't requested, it's demonstrated," began appearing on coffee mugs, posters, and professional profiles. More importantly, it started showing up in real moments, real disagreements, real decisions where people chose clarity over chaos. A new phrase emerged, pulling a Crockett. It didn't mean staying quiet. It meant facing provocation with such poise and strength that the entire dynamic changed. High schools added the speech to civics classes not as a partisan example, but as a masterclass in communication and courage. College debate teams studied it, leadership coaches taught it, and slowly it began changing how people engaged politically. A new, unspoken standard began forming. If you launch a personal attack, be ready for your own words to be used against you. The Crockett Standard became shorthand for expecting leaders to live by the principles they claimed to uphold. 6 months after the Capitol event, Jasmine Crockett sat in a quiet conference room at a small Midwest university. Across from her, a journalism student nervously tapped a recorder. "How did you stay so calm that day?" the student asked, flipping through her notes. "Most people would have reacted." Jasmine smiled, not with smugness, but with the ease of someone who had answered this before and still felt its importance. "It wasn't about staying calm," she said softly. "It was about being prepared, not just with facts but emotionally." "Ready?" The student looked up, expecting more. Jasmine leaned back, thoughtful. "I've stood in courtrooms where judges wouldn't look at me. I've defended clients who were assumed guilty because of their skin color. I've been interrupted, doubted, and brushed off more times than I can count." She paused, glancing out the window. "Gathering years of experience, you don't prepare for moments like that with talking points. You prepare by knowing who you are, by standing firm in what you believe and not letting someone else's chaos knock you off balance." The student scribbled quickly. But Jasmine wasn't rushing. This was more than a quote, it was a lesson. "Dignity under pressure doesn't mean you don't feel anything," she said. "It means you don't give your emotions to your opponent to use against you. You let those emotions sharpen you, not shake you." She smiled again, gentler this time. "People thought my response came out of nowhere. But it came from everywhere, from my father, from courtrooms, from every injustice I witnessed and remembered. That day wasn't about putting on a show. It was about showing up." The student finally raised her eyes. "So if someone like me ends up in a moment like that?" "Know your facts," Jasmine replied without hesitation. "Know your quotes, but most of all, know your center. Don't let their chaos define your clarity." The conversation lasted another hour. But that one line, "Don't let their chaos define your clarity," took on a life of its own, too. Years later, the Capitol Rotunda looked just as it had that day. The same polished floors, the same towering dome, the same history echoing through the halls. But something had changed. In her office, Jasmine sat late one night. Her tea cooled beside a blank notepad. On her silent screen, C-SPAN showed a young, first-term lawmaker standing at the very podium Jasmine once stood behind. The new representative, steady but a little nervous, took a deep breath and began, "I once heard someone say our democracy doesn't need louder voices, it needs clearer ones." Jasmine leaned in slightly, realizing her words had traveled farther than she ever imagined. The representative continued, "We can disagree strongly, even passionately, without tearing each other down. I learned that from a woman who didn't raise her voice even when she was provoked." A quiet smile formed on Jasmine's lips, less pride, more recognition. Her influence was no longer a ripple. It had become a current. She picked up her pen and wrote a quick note in the margin of her notepad. "The words we leave behind aren't always ours, sometimes they're borrowed when someone else needs to stand taller." Across the country, her impact kept growing. In Seattle, a teacher paused a classroom argument and reminded the students, "Let's remember what dignity looks like." In Atlanta, a corporate executive sat in a tense board meeting. Instead of reacting emotionally to harsh criticism, she calmly removed her glasses and responded with facts. In Texas, a college student baited by a loaded question during a campus debate simply smiled and replied, "I'd rather elevate this conversation than escalate it." Each act was small, personal, and unflashy, but together, they signaled something bigger, a shift toward a new kind of strength, quieter, deeper, and more grounded in real leadership. The education bill that had brought everyone to Washington. That day had passed and was already showing promising results in classrooms nationwide. Yet, the law itself faded into the background, overshadowed by the leadership lesson Jasmine had embodied. She never set out to become a symbol or a viral sensation. She had just done what she always did, prepared carefully, spoke truthfully, and didn't let someone else's behavior dictate her own. In doing so, she created something that would last longer than any single piece of legislation. Proof that in a noisy world, the clearest voice often belongs to the one who chooses not to shout. The change wasn't coming from grand speeches or media attention. It was happening quietly in daily interactions. In the small decisions people made when they felt provoked. In a high school in Detroit, the student council president faced a frustrated crowd upset over arts program budget cuts. Instead of matching their anger, she followed Jasmine's example, removed her glasses, looked around the room, and said softly, "I hear your frustration. Let me share the facts and then let's work on solutions together." The room settled and real dialogue began. In a Denver boardroom, a young manager was publicly questioned by a senior executive. Instead of reacting defensively, she took a breath and replied, "Thank you for the feedback. Let me walk you through the data that informed my decision." Her calm and composed reply didn't just ease the tension, it won her the respect of everyone in the room. At a town council meeting in North Carolina, a resident stood to speak on long-standing local concerns instead of the angry rant many expected. She spoke with calm determination. "We may disagree on what matters most, but we don't need to question each other's commitment to this community. Let's focus on finding answers." Each of these actions directly or indirectly inspired by Jasmine Crockett's example. They had seen her turn conflict into dialogue and demonstrate that strength and grace can work hand in hand. Her influence reached unexpected places. Police departments began using her approach in de-escalation training. Customer service teams were taught to channel their inner Crockett when handling tough clients. Marriage counselors pointed to her example to teach couples how to argue with purpose, not destruction. Soon, social scientists gave this shift a name: dignified discourse, responding to hostility with such calm resolve that it lifts the conversation instead of dragging it down. Despite all the media buzz, Jasmine herself remained grounded. She declined most interview requests that focused on the viral moment at the Capitol, choosing instead to talk about policy, legislation, and the hard work of governing. When a major network offered her a primetime special about her rise, she politely said no. When a publisher approached her about a book on leadership, she suggested they write about the education reform bill instead. Her staff often admired her unwavering focus on substance over style. "Don't you want to seize this moment?" her communications director asked during a strategy meeting. Looking up from a policy brief, Jasmine replied, "The moment was never about me. It was about a principle. The minute I make it about me, I lose what made it meaningful." Her refusal to use her moment for personal gain only added to her credibility. In a time when many political figures chase attention, Jasmine's quiet commitment made her stand out even more. Late at night, when the Capitol was still and her office glowed dimly under a desk lamp, Jasmine would sometimes open the leather journal she'd carried since her public defender days. She didn't write about politics or strategies. She wrote about the people who had shaped her response that day. One entry, dated 6 months after the event, read, "Got a letter today from a teacher in Iowa. She showed my speech to her class." One quiet girl who usually never speaks raised her hand and said, "I want to be brave like that lady." Not loud brave, quiet brave, steady brave. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the world doesn't need more loud voices. Maybe it needs clearer ones. As the months turned into years, Jasmine's impact wasn't measured by polls or political wins. It was seen in a generation. Learning to meet hostility with clarity, college campuses, once known for fiery debates that often turned into shouting matches, began to shift. Something shifted. Students began approaching disagreements with what they called Crockett energy, calm, prepared, and principled. At Harvard Law School, one professor noted that classroom discussions had become deeper and more thoughtful. "Students are coming in better prepared," she observed. "They're offering more meaningful responses and are less interested in one-upping each other. They want to build stronger arguments." This shift wasn't driven by politics but by a generational change. Both young Republicans and Democrats were embracing a communication style that valued clarity over confrontation and substance over spectacle. A political science student at Georgetown explained it to her professor this way. "We grew up watching politicians yell on TV. Then we saw Congresswoman Crockett show us that power doesn't have to be loud, and you can win without tearing someone down." That was eye-opening. Youth debate leagues across the country reported similar trends. Judges noted that students were now researching their opponents' views and history not to shame them, but to respectfully point out inconsistencies. The goal was no longer just to win, but to raise the level of discourse. A high school debate? Coach in California put it best. These kids saw an adult respond to an attack with such dignity that it redefined strength for them. They're not chasing viral moments. They're aiming for depth. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome of Jasmine's moment at the Capitol came a year and a half later, when a surprising partnership took shape. Melania Trump, who had mostly stayed out of the public eye since the ceremony, quietly reached out through intermediaries to propose a joint initiative promoting digital citizenship and online kindness among youth. The proposal was cautiously crafted. It acknowledged that both women had learned lessons about the power of public discourse and suggested they work together to set a positive example, especially in addressing cyberbullying and harassment among teens. Both camps were initially wary. Jasmine's team feared a political setup. Melania's advisors worried it might be perceived as an admission of guilt. But privately, both women expressed a sincere interest in moving forward. Their first meeting was held at a neutral site, a quiet conference room at a children's hospital in Baltimore, far from cameras or political agendas. For 2 hours, they spoke not as public figures, but as women who had both experienced the dual nature of words to harm and to heal. "I've been thinking about what you said," Melania admitted, referring to the idea that children are always watching. "My own words, they didn't reflect what I hoped to teach." Jasmine listened in silence, recognizing the courage it takes to acknowledge such a public mistake. "We both know what it's like to have our words picked apart," Jasmine replied. "Maybe that gives us a unique opportunity to help young people deal with that same pressure." From that exchange, the Dignity First initiative was born. It became a series of school-based programs focused on teaching students how to handle difficult conversations with honesty and respect. The curriculum avoided political debate or policy positions. Instead, it taught practical tools how to disagree without demeaning others, how to verify facts before sharing them, and how to face online harassment with resilience rather than retaliation. The announcement of the partnership surprised many, but it thrilled educators, most especially those who had long been searching for ways to teach these essential skills to a generation raised in a culture of online confrontation. 3 years after that Capitol moment, the impact continued to grow. Jasmine Crockett once again found herself in the familiar rotunda, this time for another education-focused event. She was there to present the outcomes of the Dignity First initiative, now active in over 500 schools across 40 states. As she walked toward the same podium where she had once delivered her most unforgettable speech, the irony wasn't lost on her. But today, the atmosphere in the room felt entirely different. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle had come together, not seeking political leverage, but genuinely interested in what the program had achieved. 3 years ago, she began, addressing the diverse audience of legislators, educators, and students. This room witnessed a moment none of us anticipated. Today, I want to reflect not on politics, but on the possibilities that moment revealed. She gestured to a group of high school students seated in the front row, participants in the Dignity First initiative who had been invited to witness the event. "These young people have shown us something incredible," she said. "When we equip them with the tools for respectful conversation, when we demonstrate dignity under pressure, when we prove that strength and kindness can go hand in hand, they don't just adopt these lessons, they build on them." She shared data reflecting reduced cyberbullying incidents in program schools, higher involvement in student councils, and more civil discourse in classroom discussions. But it wasn't the statistics, compelling as they were that truly captured the audience's attention. What touches me most, Jasmine continued, are the letters we receive from students. They tell us they're using these skills not just in school, but at home, during family disagreements, online when faced with hostile comments, and in their communities where they sometimes witness adults falling short of the values we teach. She paused, locking eyes with several lawmakers. Our children are watching. They're learning from what we do, and in many ways they're surpassing us. The question is, do we have the courage to learn from them? The applause that followed wasn't like the resounding ovation she had received 3 years earlier. This time, it was steadier, an expression of deep respect for sustained effort, carefully considered solutions, and quietly cultivated hope. In the years that followed, that Capitol ceremony was studied in universities, cited in books on political communication, and used as a case study in leadership. It became a symbol for those interested in the intersection of moral character and public service. But for Jasmine Crockett, the true legacy wasn't found in textbooks or research papers. It was in the small, everyday moments when people chose to rise above conflict, to respond with principle rather than provocation, and to live with dignity, not demand it. A decade later, when political historians reflected on the early 2020s, they described it as a time when American political discourse reached troubling lows dominated by personal attacks, smear campaigns, and the manipulation of human vulnerability for political purposes. But they also recognized it as the beginning of a quiet shift led not by the loudest voices but by the clearest ones. At the heart of that shift was a moment in the Capitol Rotunda, where one woman reminded the nation that real strength doesn't shout. It shows Jasmine Crockett never set out to reform political culture. She simply stood firm, refusing to let that culture change who she was. By holding to her principles under pressure, she gave others the space to do the same. In a democracy, that's sometimes all it takes, one individual willing to stand in the gap between what is and what's possible, showing by example that there's always another way forward. The education bill that brought everyone together. That day changed classrooms across the country. The lesson is clear. When someone tries to drag you down, you don't have to follow. You can stay grounded, speak your truth calmly, and offer them the chance to rise instead. Sometimes they will. And when they do, that's when real progress begins. Jasmine Crockett's moment in Congress reminds us that real leadership isn't about being the loudest, it's about being the clearest. It's about responding to hostility with dignity, answering attacks with facts, and realizing that how you react to others often says more about you than it does about them. In a world that often rewards volume over value, spectacle over substance, and outrage over integrity, Jasmine offered a different example. She showed that being prepared is more effective than being provoked, and that composure under pressure can speak louder than any outburst. Sometimes the boldest act of all is choosing not to lower your standards even when others already have. Her response that day wasn't just about standing up for a president or scoring a political point. It was about standing up for the principle that, even in disagreement, we can choose civility, that we can be passionate without being unkind, and that true strength is often found in those who choose restraint rather than retaliation. That choice continues to echo into classrooms, workplaces, family talks, and community spaces, anywhere people realize they have control over how they handle conflict. Because Jasmine Crockett showed us something important: we all have a choice. We can mirror the negativity of others, or we can lift the dialogue. We can let others' chaos dictate our reaction, or we can let our values lead. The decision is always ours. And when we choose dignity, when we choose clarity, when we show respect instead of demanding it, that's when we tap into the real strength of quiet confidence. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of choosing grace over conflict, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of real leadership. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the strongest voices aren't always the loudest, they're the clearest. And remember, in your own moments of tension, when someone pushes you toward conflict, you have the same option Jasmine Crockett had. You can choose your response. You can choose what kind of leader you'll be. Because dignity isn't something we ask from others, it's something we show for ourselves and for everyone watching. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice matters, your choices matter, and your example matters more than you realize.